Surgeon vanished in 2010. 7 years later, her ID is found inside a patient belly. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor provided the baseline to the chaos. In the trauma bay at Metro General Hospital, the fluorescent lights blazed with an unforgiving intensity, casting harsh shadows across the blood-soaked floor. It was 2:47 a.m. on a frigid Detroit November night in 2017, and Dr. Marcus Hayes was elbow-deep in a dying man's abdomen, fighting a war he was losing. The patient, Jake Morrison, had arrived 20 minutes earlier in the back of an unmarked sedan, dumped at the emergency entrance by two men who vanished before anyone could get a license plate. The triage nurse had found him convulsing on the pavement, a makeshift bandage soaked crimson across his midsection. His lips blue with hypoxia, his eyes rolling back into his skull. Now he lay on the surgical table, his life measured in heartbeats, each one more tenuous than the last. BP's dropping, doctor. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Yolanda Freeman, called out, her voice tight with controlled urgency. 80/40 and falling. He's got maybe 5 minutes before we lose him. Marcus nodded grimly, his hands moving with practiced precision through the surgical field. The wound was catastrophic. A stab wound, the trajectory suggesting a downward thrust from someone taller than the victim, the blade penetrating deep into the upper quadrant of the abdomen. The bleeding was arterial, pulsing with each weakening heartbeat. The blood loss massive. Suction, Marcus commanded, and his surgical nurse, Teresa, anticipated his need, clearing the pooling blood to give him visibility. Retractors. I need better exposure. The metal instruments widened the incision, spreading the tissue, revealing the landscape of trauma beneath. The liver was lacerated, a deep gash across its surface that wept blood in rhythmic spurts. Marcus packed the wound with surgical sponges, applying direct pressure, his fingers working to isolate the bleeding vessel. And then his scalpel stopped. It wasn't the soft resistance of tissue or the firm density of organ. It was something else entirely, something hard, unyielding, geometrically precise. Marcus applied more pressure, trying to work around the obstruction, but it wouldn't budge. It was embedded in the scar tissue near the liver's edge, encased in a thick biological shroud that his instruments couldn't penetrate. What the hell? He muttered, his brow furrowing beneath his surgical cap. Doctor, Teresa questioned, her eyes meeting his over her mask. There's something in here, something that shouldn't be here. He changed his approach, carefully dissecting the tissue surrounding the foreign object. The bleeding was controlled now, the immediate crisis stabilized, giving him the luxury of precision. He worked methodically, layer by layer, peeling back the fibrous scar tissue that had formed around the obstruction over what must have been months, possibly years. The object began to reveal itself. Rectangular, flat, about the size of a credit card but thicker. It was encased in a yellowish biofilm, a viscous organic coating that the body had produced in response to the foreign material, attempting to isolate it, to contain it. Forceps, Marcus ordered. The long debakis. Teresa handed him the instrument, and Marcus carefully grasped the edge of the object. It resisted, adhered to the surrounding tissue by the biofilm and fibrous adhesions. He applied gentle, steady traction, working it free millimeter by millimeter. With a final delicate maneuver, the object came loose. Marcus held it up to the surgical lights, the forceps gripping it firmly. It was heavy for its size, rigid, and utterly alien to the biological environment it had been extracted from. What is that? Yolanda asked, leaning forward to get a better view, her attention momentarily diverted from the monitors. I don't know, Marcus replied, his voice heavy with confusion and a growing sense of unease. But it was deliberately placed. This wasn't swallowed. This wasn't a surgical accident. Someone put this inside him. He placed the object in a sterile basin. Irrigation. Let's clean this off. Teresa poured warm saline over the object, washing away the biofilm and the blood. The surgical team leaned in, their curiosity overriding their clinical detachment. The routine trauma surgery transformed into something inexplicable. As the grime dissolved under the stream of saline, the object's true nature revealed itself. It was a hospital ID badge. The laminated plastic was intact, pristine despite its biological entombment. The Metro General Hospital logo was clearly visible in the upper left corner, the distinctive blue and white design unmistakable. But it was the photograph that stopped Marcus cold. A woman, Asian, early 30s perhaps. She was smiling faintly in the photo, wearing surgical scrubs, a stethoscope draped around her neck. Her eyes were intelligent, focused, the gaze of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. She had shoulder-length black hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, and there was a quiet confidence in her expression. Below the photograph, printed in bold black letters, Dr. Sarah Chen, cardiothoracic surgery,
Metro General Hospital.
And the expiration date, clear and unmistakable, March 15, 2018. Marcus stared at the badge, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The name was familiar.
Distantly familiar.
A ghost from the hospital's past. Sarah Chen, he whispered, the name triggering a cascade of fragmented memories. I know that name. Teresa's eyes widened in recognition. Dr. Chen? The cardiac surgeon who disappeared. The memory came flooding back. It had been 7 years ago, back in 2010, when Marcus was still a resident. The hospital had been rocked by the disappearance of one of their most promising young surgeons. Dr. Sarah Chen, a brilliant cardiothoracic specialist, had vanished without a trace. Marcus remembered the police presence in the hospital, the interviews, the speculation. Sarah had finished an 18-hour shift, a complex series of back-to-back cardiac surgeries that had pushed even her exceptional skills to their limit. She had been exhausted, running on caffeine and adrenaline, but she had saved 3 lives that day. She had left the hospital around 8 p.m., walking to her car in the parking structure. Security footage showed her getting into her vehicle, a silver Honda Accord, and driving away. That was the last time anyone saw her. Her car was found the next morning at the Detroit River waterfront, parked haphazardly near the abandoned docks. The doors were unlocked. The keys were in the ignition. Her phone was gone. Her wallet was gone. Her hospital ID badge was gone. There was no sign of struggle. No blood. No witnesses. Nothing. The initial assumption had been suicide. The river was a common location for such tragedies, and Sarah had been working punishing hours, the stress of cardiac surgery taking its toll. But her husband, Dr. David Chen, an anesthesiologist who also worked at Metro General, had insisted that Sarah would never take her own life. She loved her work. She loved him. She had plans for the future. The police had investigated other possibilities. Random violence, carjacking gone wrong, abduction. But with no body, no evidence, and no leads, the case had gone cold within months. The hospital had held a memorial service. An empty casket, tearful colleagues, Dr. David Chen, standing alone at the front, his face a mask of devastated grief, staring at the photograph of his wife as if he could will her back into existence. And now, 7 years later, her ID badge had been found inside a living patient. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the operating room. This wasn't a relic from a corpse. This wasn't evidence of a long-dead victim finally surfacing. This was something else entirely. This was a message. "We need to report this," Marcus said, his voice sharp with urgency. "Right now. Teresa, secure this badge in a biohazard container. Document everything. Photographs. Chain of custody. This is evidence." He turned his attention back to Jake Morrison, lying unconscious on the table. His life saved, but his secrets still locked away. "Let's close him up," Marcus commanded, his hands returning to the surgical field. "And then we need to call the police. And we need to call Dr. Chen." "Which Dr. Chen?" Yolanda asked. Marcus met her gaze, the weight of the discovery settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "The husband, David. He still works here, doesn't he?" Teresa nodded slowly, her expression troubled. "4th floor. Anesthesiology. He's working the night shift." The irony was cruel. While Marcus had been extracting Sarah Chen's ID badge from a patient's abdomen, her husband had been in the same building, 3 floors above, administering anesthesia to another patient, maintaining his careful routine, living in the shadow of a grief that had defined the last 7 years of his life. Marcus finished the surgery, his movements mechanical, his mind racing. The liver laceration was repaired, the bleeding controlled, the abdomen closed with neat, precise sutures. Jake Morrison's vital signs stabilized, his blood pressure rising, his heart rate steady. He would live. But the questions his presence raised were just beginning. As the surgical team wheeled Jake to the recovery room, Marcus stripped off his gloves and gown, his hands trembling slightly. He walked directly to the administrative office, carrying the sealed biohazard container with Sarah Chen's ID badge, the plastic laminate catching the fluorescent light. The hospital administrator on night duty, a weary-eyed man named Gerald Hoffman, looked up from his desk as Marcus entered without knocking. "Dr. Hayes, what? We have a situation," Marcus interrupted, placing the container on the desk. "A major situation. I need you to pull up personnel records for Dr. Sarah Chen. Cardiothoracic surgery. And I need you to contact the police immediately. Homicide division. And I need you to page Dr. David Chun to your office. Now." Gerald's confusion gave way to alarm as Marcus explained the discovery. The impossible object extracted from the patient's body, the name on the badge, the implications that rippled outward like shockwaves. Within 15 minutes, the administrative office was crowded with people. Hospital security. The chief of surgery, Dr. Raymond Foster, hastily dressed and looking shaken. A police detective from the night shift, Detective Laura Reeves, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s with the weathered look of someone who had seen Detroit's darkest corners. And Dr. David Chen. Marcus watched as David entered the office, his expression puzzled, slightly annoyed at being pulled from his shift. He was in his early 40s, lean and compact, with the careful, controlled movements of someone who had learned to manage his emotions through rigid discipline. His black hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, held a deep weariness that spoke of years of accumulated sorrow. He still wore his wedding ring. Marcus noticed it immediately, the gold band catching the light as David crossed his arms, waiting for an explanation. "Dr. Chun," Gerald began, his voice careful, measured, as if he were defusing a bomb. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down." "I'm in the middle of a case," David replied, his tone clipped. "I have a patient under anesthesia. This better be." "Dr. Hayes covered for you," Dr. Foster interjected. "David, please. Seat." The formality of the request, the unusual gathering of personnel, the presence of the police detective, it all registered on David's face. He sat slowly, his body rigid, his gaze moving from face to face, searching for answers. "What's happened?" he asked, and Marcus heard the thread of fear beneath the question. "Is someone hurt? Is there?" Gerald slid the biohazard container across the desk. "Dr. Hayes performed an emergency surgery tonight," Gerald explained. "He extracted a foreign object from a patient. Dr. Chun, I need you to look at this and tell us if you recognize it." David's eyes moved to the container. Through the clear plastic, Sarah's ID badge was visible, the photograph facing upward, her smile frozen in time. Marcus watched David's face as the recognition hit him. It was like witnessing a controlled demolition. The careful composure crumbled. The color drained from his skin. His hands gripped the armrests of the chair, knuckles white, the gold wedding ring pressing into the wood. "No," David whispered, the word barely audible.
No.
That can't be." He reached for the container with trembling hands, pulling it closer, staring at the badge as if it were an apparition, a trick of the light, something his exhausted mind had conjured. "Sarah," he breathed, his finger tracing the outline of her photograph through the plastic. "This is Sarah's badge, her hospital ID. But it was missing. When we lost her, her ID was never found." "Dr. Chun," Detective Reeves said gently, stepping forward, "I need you to understand what Dr. Hayes is telling you. This badge wasn't found at a crime scene. It wasn't recovered from the river. It was found inside a living patient. During surgery. Tonight." The words hung in the air, their implications too vast, too impossible to immediately process. David looked up, his eyes moving from the detective to Marcus, searching for confirmation, for sanity, for some explanation that made sense. "Inside a patient?" he repeated, his voice hollow. "What do you mean, inside a patient?" Marcus stepped forward, his medical training allowing him to deliver the information with clinical precision, a buffer against the emotional devastation unfolding before him. "The patient came in with a stab wound," Marcus explained. "During the surgery, I encountered an obstruction near the liver. The badge was embedded in scar tissue, encased in biofilm. It had been there for months, possibly years. It was deliberately placed, Dr. Chun. Someone performed surgery on this patient and put your wife's ID badge inside his body." The silence that followed was absolute. The implications crashed down on everyone in the room, the impossible becoming undeniable. Sarah Chun hadn't died 7 years ago. She couldn't have. Dead people don't perform surgeries. Dead people don't hide their ID badges inside living patients. David Chen's carefully constructed world, built on 7 years of managed grief and controlled acceptance, shattered in that moment. The sanctuary he had built around his loss, the routine that had kept him functioning, the careful distance he had maintained from hope, it all collapsed. He doubled over in the chair, his hands covering his face, and Marcus heard the sound of a man's grief tearing itself apart and rebuilding into something new and terrifying. "Hope. She's alive," David whispered through his fingers, the words both a prayer and a curse. "Sarah's alive. After 7 years, she's alive." Detective Reeves exchanged a glance with Dr. Foster, her expression grim. "Dr. Chun," she said carefully, "if your wife is alive, we need to find her, and we need to understand why she would do this. Why would she hide her ID inside a patient?" David lowered his hands, and Marcus saw that his eyes were dry. There were no tears, just a terrible, burning intensity. "Because she's trying to tell us something," David said, his voice gaining strength, the shock giving way to determination. "Because she knew that patient would end up in a hospital eventually. She knew a surgeon would find it. She knew someone would recognize her name." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "She's sending us a message. She's telling us she's still out there. She's telling us to come find her." Detective Reeves nodded slowly, her mind already working through the implications, the investigative pathways opening before her. "Then that's exactly what we're going to do," she said. "But first, we need to talk to the patient. We need to know where he was treated, who performed the surgery, and where we can find your wife." The hunt for Sarah Chun had begun. The impossible had become reality. And David Chun, after 7 years of grief, was about to discover that hope could be more agonizing than despair. Because if Sarah was alive, where had she been? And what had she endured for 7 years that would drive her to such a desperate, calculated act? The answers, they would soon discover, were darker than any of them could have imagined. The recovery room at Metro General Hospital was a dim sanctuary of beeping monitors and hushed voices, the air thick with the antiseptic smell of disinfectant and the metallic undertone of blood. Jake Morrison lay in the bed, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of medicated sleep, tubes snaking from his arms, monitors tracking every vital sign. He was alive, stabilized, the crisis of the surgery behind him. But the real interrogation was just beginning. Detective Laura Reeves stood at the foot of the bed, her arms crossed, her sharp eyes studying the young man who held the key to finding Sarah Chun. She had seen countless criminals in her 12 years on the Detroit police force, had navigated the city's gang territories and drug networks, had learned to read the subtle signs of deception and fear. And Jake Morrison was terrified. David Chun stood beside her, his presence a violation of protocol, but no one had the heart to make him leave. He hadn't gone home, hadn't changed out of his scrubs. His eyes were fixed on Jake with an intensity that bordered on desperation, his hands clenched at his sides, the gold wedding ring catching the dim light. "Mr. Morrison," Laura began, her voice calm but authoritative, the tone of someone accustomed to extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. "You're lucky to be alive. Dr. Hayes saved your life tonight. Now I need you to help us save someone else. Jake's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus through the haze of pain medication. He was young, maybe 30 at most, with the lean, wary look of someone who had grown up on Detroit's hardest streets. Tattoos crawled up his neck, gang symbols that Laura recognized immediately. He was affiliated with the East Side Crew, a mid-level drug operation that controlled several blocks near the old automotive plants. I don't know nothing, Jake mumbled, his voice thick and slurred. I ain't talking to no cops. Laura stepped closer, her expression softening slightly, employing the empathy that sometimes worked where intimidation failed. Jake, we found something inside you during the surgery, something that doesn't belong there. A hospital ID badge. It belonged to a doctor, a woman who disappeared 7 years ago. Her name is Dr. Sarah Chin. She pulled out her phone, showing Jake a photograph of Sarah, a professional headshot from the hospital directory, her intelligent eyes staring out from the screen. This woman performed surgery on you, didn't she? She's the one who put that badge inside you. Jake's eyes widened slightly, recognition flickering across his features before he could suppress it. He tried to turn his head away, but David moved suddenly, his control snapping. Where is she? David demanded, his voice raw with emotion, leaning over the bed rail. Where did they take you? What clinic? What location? Dr. Chen? Laura warned, placing a hand on his arm, but David shook her off. She's my wife, David said, his voice breaking. Sarah is my wife. She's been missing for 7 years. 7 years. And you know where she is. Jake stared at David, seeing the desperation, the anguish, the years of accumulated grief pouring out. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of human empathy breaking through the hardened criminal exterior. Man, I'm sorry, Jake whispered. I'm sorry, but I can't help you. If I talk, they'll kill me. They'll kill my family. You don't understand what these people are capable of. Then make me understand. David pressed, his voice urgent. Tell me who they are. Tell me where they're keeping her. Jake shook his head, his eyes filling with tears, the pain medication lowering his defenses, the truth spilling out despite his fear. I got stabbed 3 months ago, he began, his voice barely audible. Gang fight. Bad one. Blade went deep. I was bleeding out, dying in the street. My crew, they couldn't take me to a hospital. I got warrants. I'd get arrested soon as they ID'd me. He paused, his breathing labored, the memories clearly painful. They took me to the network. That's what they call it on the streets. The network. It's an underground medical operation. They treat people like me, people who can't go to real hospitals. Gang members, fugitives, illegals, people with no papers, no insurance, no options. Laura's mind was already racing, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. She had heard whispers of such an operation during her years in narcotics, rumors of a clandestine medical facility that served Detroit's criminal underworld. But it had always been speculation, urban legend, nothing concrete enough to investigate. Where is this network? Laura asked. What part of the city? I don't know exactly, Jake insisted, his frustration evident. They blindfolded me, put a hood over my head, drove me around for like an hour, maybe more. Could have been going in circles for all I know, making sure I couldn't track the route. What do you remember? David interjected, his medical training kicking in, approaching the problem methodically. Sounds, smells, anything distinctive. How long was the drive? What kind of road surface? Jake closed his eyes, trying to recall details through the fog of pain and fear. Smooth roads at first, regular streets. Then it got rough. Potholes. Felt like we were in the old industrial area, you know? Where all the factories shut down. I could hear our voices echo when they took me inside. Big space. Empty. Like a warehouse or something. And the surgery? David pressed. Tell me about the doctor. About Sarah. She was the one who operated on me. Jake confirmed, his voice gaining strength as the memories surfaced. Asian lady, late 30s maybe. She looked tired, man. Exhausted. like she hadn't slept in years. But her hands, they were steady, professional. She knew what she was doing. David felt a surge of emotion, the confirmation that Sarah was alive, that she was still practicing medicine, still using her skills, still surviving. "Did she speak to you?" David asked. "Did she say anything?" Jake nodded slowly. "She told me the surgery was gonna hurt because they didn't have enough anesthesia. Said she was sorry, that she'd do her best to keep me alive. She sounded sad, like she didn't want to be there, like she was being forced." The word hung in the air. Forced. They're holding her captive, David realized, the full horror of the situation crystallizing. She's not working for them voluntarily. They've been holding her for 7 years, forcing her to perform surgeries. Laura's expression hardened, her detective's instincts confirming what David had realized. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. This was kidnapping, false imprisonment, organized crime on a scale that went far beyond typical gang activity. "Jake," Laura said, her voice taking on a new urgency. "How many guards were there? How many people did you see?" "A lot," Jake replied, his fear returning. "Maybe 6, 7 guys with guns. Military-style weapons. They weren't regular street thugs. These were professionals. Organized. They had a whole operation set up. Operating room, equipment, supplies. It was like a real hospital, just hidden underground." "Underground?" David questioned. "You mean a basement?" "Yeah, basement levels. Old factory or something. The room where she operated, it was below ground. I remember the stairs going down, and it was cold. Real cold. Like they had AC running full blast to keep it sterile." Laura pulled out her notebook, documenting every detail, building a profile of the facility. Basement level. Industrial area. Large structure. Climate controlled. Armed guards. Professional operation. "What about after the surgery?" Laura continued. "How long were you there?" 2 days, maybe 3, Jake said. "They kept me in a room, drugged up. The doctor, your wife, she came to check on me a few times. Changed bandages. Gave me antibiotics. She barely spoke. Just did her job and left." "Did you see other patients?" David asked. "Was there anyone else being treated?" Jake nodded. 2 others. One dude with a gunshot wound. Another guy, I don't know what was wrong with him, but he looked bad. They kept us separated mostly. Different rooms. The scope of the operation was becoming clear. This wasn't a makeshift clinic. This was a sophisticated underground hospital, serving Detroit's criminal population, generating revenue from people who had nowhere else to turn. "And when they released you?" Laura pressed. "How did that work?" "They just dumped me," Jake said bitterly. "Drove me back to the city, hood over my head again. Threw me out in an alley near downtown. Told me if I ever talked to the cops, they'd find me and kill me. And they would. These people, they got connections everywhere. They got eyes in the hospitals, in the police department, everywhere." Laura exchanged a glance with David, the implications chilling. If the network had infiltrated legitimate institutions, the investigation would be compromised from the start. "Jake," David said, his voice softening, appealing to the young man's humanity. "I understand you're scared. I understand the risk. But my wife has been held prisoner for 7 years. 7 years of her life stolen. She's being forced to operate on criminals, to use her skills under duress. And she risked everything to send that message, to hide her ID inside you, because she knew eventually you'd need real medical care. She was counting on someone finding it. She was counting on me finding her." Jake stared at David, the weight of the revelation settling on him. He had been carrying Sarah's desperate message inside his body for 3 months. A living time capsule, a cry for help embedded in flesh. "She saved my life," Jake whispered. "Even though I'm just some street punk. Even though she was being forced. She still did everything she could to keep me alive. That's who she is," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the woman I married. And I need to bring her home." The silence stretched between them, the monitors beeping steadily, marking time, marking the seconds Sarah remained in captivity. Finally, Jake spoke. There was one thing, he said slowly. When they drove me back, when they dumped me in the alley, I pulled the hood off quick, tried to see which direction they were headed. I saw the van. It was a white cargo van. No windows. But on the back bumper there was a sticker. One of those company parking stickers, you know? For employee parking. What company? Laura demanded, leaning forward. Packard, Jake said. The old Packard automotive plant. The sticker said Packard employee parking. Laura felt a jolt of adrenaline. The Packard plant. One of Detroit's most notorious abandoned structures. A massive complex of factories and warehouses that had been shuttered for decades. It was a labyrinth of crumbling concrete and rusted steel. A favorite location for urban explorers, drug dealers, and anyone who needed to disappear. Are you certain? Laura pressed. You're sure it said Packard? Jake nodded emphatically. Yeah, I'm sure. I remember thinking it was weird. Why would they have a parking sticker for a place that's been closed for like 30 years? David understood immediately. Because they're using the abandoned facility. The parking sticker is old, leftover from when the plant was operational. They're operating out of the Packard plant. Laura was already on her phone, pulling up satellite imagery of the area. The massive complex sprawling across multiple city blocks, dozens of buildings, underground tunnels connecting the structures. If they're in there, Laura said grimly, it's going to be like finding a needle in a haystack. That place is enormous and dangerous. The floors are unstable, the ceilings are collapsing. It's a death trap. But it's a lead, David insisted. It's the first real lead we've had in 7 years. We have to search it. We have to. We need a tactical team, Laura interrupted. If what Jake is telling us is true, if there are armed guards and a sophisticated operation, we can't just walk in there. We need FBI involvement. Organized crime task force. Hostage rescue. That will take time, David protested, his frustration boiling over. Time Sarah doesn't have. If the network knows we found the badge, if they suspect we're looking for them, they'll move her. They'll destroy evidence. He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the fear that had been growing in his chest since the moment he saw Sarah's ID badge. They'll kill her. Laura placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression sympathetic but firm. Dr. Chun, I understand your urgency, but if we go in unprepared, we'll get Sarah killed. And ourselves. We need to do this right. We need surveillance, reconnaissance, we need to know exactly where she is before we move. David knew she was right. His medical training, his years of experience in high-stakes surgical situations, told him that rushing in without preparation was a recipe for disaster. But every fiber of his being screamed at him to act, to run to the Packard plant, to tear the place apart with his bare hands until he found her. How long? David asked, his voice strained. How long until we can move? Laura checked her watch, calculating timelines, coordination with federal agencies, the logistics of mounting a raid on such a massive target. 48 hours, she said. Maybe less if I can expedite the approvals. But I need you to trust me, Dr. Chun. I will find your wife. I promise you. David nodded slowly, the weight of the weight settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. 48 hours. 2 days. After 7 years, 2 more days should be nothing. But it felt like an eternity. As Laura left to coordinate with her superiors, David returned his attention to Jake Morrison, the young man who had unwittingly carried Sarah's message, who had been saved by her skill and compassion even in captivity. Thank you, David said quietly, for telling us, for taking the risk. Jake met his gaze, something like respect passing between them. Bring her home, Doc, Jake said. She deserves to be free. David touched his wedding ring, the gold band he had never removed, the symbol of a promise he had made 15 years ago. I will, he said, no matter what it takes. Outside the hospital, as dawn broke over Detroit's skyline, the hunt for Sarah Chun entered its most dangerous phase. The impossible had become reality. Hope had been resurrected from the grave. And in the abandoned ruins of the Packard plant, somewhere in the darkness of Detroit's industrial graveyard, Sarah Chun was waiting. Waiting for rescue. Waiting for freedom. waiting for the 7-year nightmare to finally end. The Packard automotive plant loomed against the Detroit skyline like a decaying monument to industrial collapse. Sprawling across multiple city blocks, the complex was a labyrinth of crumbling concrete and twisted steel, its broken windows staring out like empty eye sockets, its corridors choked with debris and the ghosts of a forgotten era. For decades it had stood abandoned, a playground for urban explorers and a haven for the desperate and the criminal. And somewhere within its rotting heart, Sarah Chun was waiting. David stood in the makeshift command center, a surveillance van parked 3 blocks from the plant's perimeter, surrounded by FBI agents and tactical operators preparing for the raid. 48 hours had passed since Jake Morrison's revelation. 48 hours of meticulous reconnaissance, thermal imaging, and intelligence gathering. The surveillance had confirmed what they suspected. There was activity in the plant's basement levels, heat signatures indicating human presence, power consumption suggesting sophisticated equipment operating below ground. The network was there, and Sarah was with them. Detective Laura Reeves stood beside David, reviewing the tactical plan on a digital tablet, the building's layout overlaid with entry points and potential hazards. The assault would be coordinated, precise, designed to minimize casualties and maximize the chances of recovering Sarah alive. But David could barely focus on the details. His mind was consumed with images of Sarah, of what 7 years of captivity might have done to her, of whether she would even recognize him, whether the woman he found would still be the woman he had lost. "Dr. Chun," Laura said, pulling him from his thoughts. "I need you to understand something. When we go in, you stay here. This is a tactical operation. Armed hostiles, potential hostages. The last thing we need is a civilian in the crossfire." David nodded mechanically, but Laura saw the resistance in his eyes, the desperate need to be there when they found Sarah. "David," she said, using his first name, her voice softening. "I know what you want, but the best thing you can do for Sarah right now is let us do our job. We'll bring her out. I promise." The raid launched at 4:47 a.m., the optimal time when human alertness was at its lowest. The tactical teams moved through the darkness like shadows, approaching the plant from multiple angles, thermal imaging confirming the presence of guards at strategic points around the basement entrance. David watched the operation unfold on the monitor feeds, his heart pounding, his hands clenched so tightly that his fingernails cut into his palms. He saw the teams breach the exterior, saw the flashbang grenades detonate in controlled bursts, heard the staccato rhythm of suppressed gunfire through the radio chatter. Alpha Team, perimeter secured. 2 hostiles down, non-lethal. Bravo Team advancing to basement level. Encountering resistance. The firefight was brief and professional. The network's guards, despite their weapons and training, were overwhelmed by the coordinated assault. Within 8 minutes, the upper levels were secured. And then came the transmission David had been waiting for. "We've found the surgical facility. Basement level, southeast quadrant. Multiple rooms. We have visual on medical equipment. Stand by." The silence that followed was excruciating. David leaned closer to the monitor, watching the grainy bodycam footage from the team leader, the image shaking as the operator moved through the underground corridor, the harsh beam of the tactical flashlight cutting through the darkness. The surgical facility was exactly as Jake had described. A converted basement space, surprisingly clean and organized, equipped with real medical equipment, surgical lights, monitoring devices, for stands. It was a grotesque parody of a legitimate hospital, a sterile environment carved out of industrial decay. And in the center of the room, standing frozen in the harsh glare of the tactical lights, was Sarah Chun. David's breath caught in his throat. Even through the distorted bodycam footage, he recognized her immediately. 7 years older, thinner, her face marked by exhaustion and trauma, but unmistakably Sarah. She wore surgical scrubs, blood-stained and worn, her hands raised instinctively in surrender, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. "Federal agents. Hands where we can see them," the team leader commanded. Sarah complied immediately, her hands trembling, her mouth moving but no sound coming through the audio feed. David could see the terror in her posture, The way she flinched at the sudden intrusion, the years of captivity having conditioned her to expect violence. "We're looking for Dr. Sarah Chan," the operator continued, his weapon trained on her but his voice gentler now, recognizing the victim before him. "Are you Sarah Chen?" She nodded slowly, her lips forming the word yes. Her voice too quiet to pick up on the microphone. "You're safe now, doctor. We're here to get you out. Is anyone else in the facility? Are there other hostages?" Sarah shook her head, then hesitated, pointing to a door at the far end of the room. The tactical team moved quickly, breaching the door to find 2 patients in recovery beds, both under sedation, both connected to monitoring equipment. Gang members, criminals, people the network had operated on in the previous days. "We have 2 additional victims. Medical status unknown. Requesting immediate medical evac." David couldn't wait any longer. Despite Laura's protests, despite the tactical protocols, he bolted from the command van and ran toward the plant, his credentials getting him past the perimeter guards, his desperation overriding every regulation and safety procedure. He descended into the basement, following the lit pathway the tactical teams had established, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. And then he was there, standing in the doorway of the surgical facility, seeing Sarah not through a monitor but with his own eyes. She was sitting on a gurney now, wrapped in a tactical blanket, an FBI medic checking her vital signs. Her hair was longer than he remembered, streaked with gray. Her hands, still so steady and precise when she operated, trembled in her lap. She looked small, diminished, a shadow of the vibrant surgeon he had married. "Sarah?" David whispered, the name catching in his throat. She looked up at the sound of his voice, her eyes searching the room until they found him. For a moment, there was no recognition, just confusion, the face of a stranger. And then something flickered in her expression, a spark of memory fighting through 7 years of trauma. "David?" she said, her voice hoarse, uncertain, as if she were trying to remember a language she had forgotten. He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees in front of her, his hands reaching for hers but hesitating, afraid that touching her might shatter the moment, might reveal this to be another cruel dream. "It's me," he said, tears streaming down his face, all the professional composure of the anesthesiologist stripped away, leaving only the husband who had waited 7 years for this moment. "Sarah, it's me. I found you. I finally found you." Her hands moved slowly, reaching up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that hadn't been there 7 years ago, the gray in his hair, the changes that time and grief had carved into him. "You're real," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I was hallucinating again. They used to drug me when I tried to escape. I'd see you in the hallucinations. I'd see our house. I'd see." She couldn't finish. The dam broke, and 7 years of suppressed emotion came flooding out. She collapsed against him, her body racked with sobs, her hands clutching his shirt as if he might disappear if she let go. David held her, his own tears mixing with hers, his arms wrapped around her with a fierce protectiveness, as if he could shield her from the memories, from the trauma, from the 7 years of horror she had endured. "I'm sorry," he kept saying, the words meaningless but necessary. "I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner. I looked. I never stopped looking. I never gave up." "I know," Sarah managed between sobs. "I knew you'd come. That's why I put the badge in that patient. I knew he'd end up in a real hospital. I knew someone would find it. I knew you'd understand." The network's leader, a man named Victor Kane, was apprehended trying to escape through the plant's tunnel system. The evidence recovered from the facility was overwhelming. Financial records, patient logs, supplier contacts. The entire operation was documented. A criminal enterprise that had generated millions of dollars over the years, serving gang members, fugitives, and anyone desperate enough to pay for underground medical care. But Sarah was the key. Her testimony would dismantle the organization, expose the corruption that had allowed it to operate for so long, bring justice to the dozens of people who had been exploited by the system. In the weeks that followed, Sarah was hospitalized at Metro General, not as a doctor but as a patient. The physical examination revealed malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, the long-term effects of chronic stress and inadequate self-care. But the psychological trauma was far worse. 7 years of captivity, of forced labor, of watching people die when she couldn't save them, of performing surgery under the threat of violence. David never left her side. He took a leave of absence from the hospital, sleeping in a chair beside her bed, holding her hand through the nightmares, talking her through the panic attacks when the walls seemed to close in. "They took me from the parking lot," Sarah told him one night, her voice distant, as if she were describing events that had happened to someone else. 3 men. They had a van. They drugged me before I could scream. When I woke up, I was in that basement. She paused, her breathing shallow, the memories clearly painful. They told me I was going to work for them, that I was going to operate on their people, their patients. I refused at first. I fought them. So they brought in a man, someone who needed surgery, a gunshot wound. And they told me if I didn't operate, they'd let him bleed out in front of me. David listened, his hand tightening around hers, his heart breaking with every word. "I tried to escape twice in the first year," Sarah continued. "The first time, they caught me in the tunnels. They beat me, locked me in a cell for 2 weeks with no food. The second time, I almost made it outside. But they had cameras everywhere. They dragged me back, and they brought in a patient, a young woman, and they shot her in front of me. They said that was what happened when I disobeyed." "Sarah," David whispered, unable to bear the horror of what she was describing. "So I stopped fighting," she said, her voice empty. "I just operated. I saved who I could save. I used my skills to keep people alive, even though they were criminals, even though I was being forced. Because the oath I took, the promise to do no harm, it was all I had left. It was the only thing they couldn't take from me. The badge," she explained, had been her final act of defiance. She had kept it hidden for 7 years, sewn into the lining of her surgical scrubs, waiting for the right moment, the right patient. Jake Morrison had been that patient, young enough to survive the complication, healthy enough that the foreign object wouldn't kill him immediately, but guaranteed to need real medical care eventually when the infection set in. "It was a time bomb," Sarah said. "A message in a bottle. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try. Couldn't let you think I was dead. I couldn't let them win." 6 months later, Sarah stood before the Medical Ethics Board, her license under review, her future uncertain. The hearing room was packed with colleagues, reporters, and observers, all waiting to see whether the brilliant surgeon who had been held captive would be allowed to practice again. The board's questions were difficult, probing the ethical implications of her forced complicity, the surgeries she had performed on criminals, the lives she had saved while in captivity. "Dr. Chun," the board chairman asked, "you performed hundreds of surgeries over 7 years on individuals involved in criminal activity. You saved the lives of gang members, drug dealers, fugitives. Doesn't that make you complicit in their crimes?" Sarah met his gaze steadily, her voice calm but firm. "I took an oath," she said, "to do no harm, to preserve life. That oath doesn't have exceptions for criminals or saints. Every person who came to me was bleeding, dying, suffering. And I was a surgeon. That's who I am. Not because they forced me, but because saving lives is what I do." She paused, her hands folded in her lap, the scars of 7 years visible in her posture but not in her resolve. "They took 7 years of my life. They took my freedom. But they didn't take my oath. They didn't take what makes me a doctor." The room was silent. The board voted to restore her license. 1 year after her rescue, Sarah Chun returned to Metro General Hospital. Not to the operating room, the trauma was still too fresh, the memories too overwhelming. But to teach, to share her knowledge with the next generation of surgeons, to transform her pain into purpose. David stood in the back of the lecture hall, watching his wife address a room full of medical students, her voice strong and clear, her hands gesturing as she explained complex surgical techniques, her passion for medicine undimmed despite everything she had endured. They had rebuilt their life together. Not the life they had before, that was gone, lost to 7 years of darkness. But something new, Something harder but more precious. A relationship forged in trauma and tempered by survival. That evening, they walked along the Detroit River waterfront, the same place where Sarah's car had been found 7 years ago, the place where everyone had assumed she had died. "I used to dream about this," Sarah said, her hand in David's, her voice soft. "Walking beside the water, feeling the wind, being free." David squeezed her hand, the gold wedding band on his finger catching the sunset light. "You're home now," he said simply. Sarah looked at him, her eyes clear, her smile genuine despite the shadows that would never fully leave. "I know," she said. "Finally, I know." The courtroom was suffocating. The air hung heavy with the weight of testimony, the walls closing in with each new revelation of horror. Sarah Chand sat in the witness box, her hands folded carefully in her lap, her posture rigid with control. She wore a simple gray suit, professional and understated, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. But beneath the composed exterior, David could see the tremors, the subtle signs of the psychological battle she was waging just to remain in that room. It was March 2018, for months since her rescue, and the trial of Victor Kane and 17 of his associates had become a media sensation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, their cameras focused on Sarah, hungry for every detail of her captivity, every moment of her suffering transformed into headline material. David sat in the front row of the gallery, positioned where Sarah could see him, where his presence could serve as an anchor when the questions became too difficult, when the memories threatened to pull her under. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet Carver, approached the witness stand with careful deference, understanding that Sarah was both their strongest witness and their most fragile. "Dr. Chun," Janet began, her voice measured and respectful. "I know this is difficult, but I need you to walk the jury through what happened on March 15, 2010. The day you were taken." Sarah took a slow breath, her eyes finding David's for strength, then turning to face the jury. 12 ordinary people who would decide the fate of the men who had stolen 7 years of her life. "I finished my shift around 7:45 p.m., Sarah began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I had performed 3 cardiac surgeries that day, back-to-back cases. A valve replacement, a coronary bypass, and an emergency repair of an aortic dissection. I was exhausted. I just wanted to go home." She paused, the memory clearly painful despite the clinical precision of her recounting. "I walked to my car in the parking structure. Level 3. I remember the fluorescent lights flickering. I remember thinking I needed to tell security about it. And then I heard footsteps behind me. Fast. Running." The courtroom was silent, every person leaning forward, drawn into the narrative. Before I could turn around, someone grabbed me from behind, an arm around my throat, cutting off my air. I tried to fight, tried to scream, but then I felt the needle, sharp pain in my neck, and then nothing, just darkness. Janet nodded, giving Sarah a moment to compose herself before continuing. "When you regained consciousness, where were you?" "In the basement," Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The Packard plant basement. I was on a metal cot in a small room, maybe 8 by 10 feet. Concrete walls. A single light bulb. No windows. The door was steel, locked from the outside." She described the first days of her captivity with a detached, clinical precision that David recognized as a coping mechanism, a way to distance herself from the trauma by treating it as a medical case study. "Victor Kane came to see me on the second day," Sarah continued, her eyes hardening at the mention of his name. "He told me what I was there for, that I was going to work for him, that his organization provided medical services to people who couldn't go to legitimate hospitals. Gang members, fugitives, people involved in criminal activity." "And what was your response?" Janet asked. "I refused," Sarah said firmly. "I told him I'd taken an oath, that I wouldn't use my skills to help criminals, that he could kill me, but I wouldn't cooperate." "What happened then?" Sarah's composure cracked slightly, her voice thickening with emotion. "He brought in a patient, a young man, maybe 19 years old, with a gunshot wound to the abdomen. He was bleeding out, going into shock. Victor put a gun to my head and told me I had a choice. Operate and save the patient, or watch him die and then be killed myself. The jury shifted uncomfortably, the moral complexity of the situation settling over them. So I operated, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I saved that boy's life. And then I saved the next one and the next one. For 7 years, I operated on anyone they brought me, because the alternative was letting them die. And I couldn't do that. I couldn't violate my oath, even if following it meant being complicit in their crimes. Janet approached with a series of photographs, medical records seized from the network's facility during the raid. Dr. Chun, the prosecution has documented 247 surgeries you performed during your captivity. Can you explain the conditions under which you worked? Sarah studied the records, her professional eye scanning the details, the memories flooding back. The equipment was surprisingly sophisticated, she explained. Victor Kane had invested heavily in the operation. Real surgical lights, monitoring equipment, anesthesia machines. But the supplies were limited. I had to ration medications, reuse instruments that should have been disposable, adapt procedures to work with what I had available. She pointed to one of the records, a complex gunshot wound repair. This patient had a bullet lodged near his spine. In a real hospital, I would have had a neurosurgeon assist, advanced imaging, a full surgical team. But I was alone. I had one nurse, untrained, just following my instructions. I had to perform a procedure that should have required specialists, and I had to do it perfectly because if the patient died, I knew Victor would punish me. How did he punish you? Janet asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Sarah's hands tightened in her lap, the tremor becoming more pronounced. The first time I tried to escape, she began, her voice barely audible. He locked me in isolation for 2 weeks. No food, just water, in complete darkness. I lost track of time. I started hallucinating, seeing things that weren't there. She paused, struggling to continue. The second time, he brought in a patient, a young woman with a stab wound, survivable, easy to repair, and he shot her in front of me, executed her while I watched. He told me that was what happened when I disobeyed, that every time I tried to escape, someone would die, that their blood would be on my hands. Several jurors had tears in their eyes. David saw one woman covering her mouth, suppressing a sob. Janet let the testimony sink in before asking her final question. Dr. Chun, why did you hide your hospital ID badge inside Jake Morrison? What were you hoping would accomplish? Sarah turned to look directly at the jury, her composure returning, her voice gaining strength. I knew Jake would eventually need real medical care, she explained. The placement of the badge was deliberate. I positioned it where it would cause chronic inflammation, intermittent pain, but not immediate life-threatening complications. I calculated that within 3 to 6 months, he would develop an abscess or obstruction that would force him to seek emergency treatment. The clinical precision of the explanation was chilling, the calculated risk evident. I knew that when a surgeon found the badge, they would recognize it. They would see it was from a legitimate hospital. They would trace it back to me. It was my only way to send a message to the outside world. My only way to tell my husband that I was still alive, that I was still fighting. She looked at David, her eyes filling with tears for the first time during the testimony. I couldn't let David think I was dead, couldn't let them win. So I did the only thing I could. I used my skills as a surgeon to send a message. I turned a patient into a messenger. And I prayed that someone would understand. The prosecution rested. The defense attorneys tried to poke holes in Sarah's testimony, tried to suggest she had been a willing participant, that she had profited from the arrangement, that her captivity had been exaggerated. But the medical evidence was overwhelming. The malnutrition, the vitamin deficiencies, the psychological trauma. The surveillance footage recovered from the network's facility showing Sarah being escorted under armed guard between her cell and the operating room. The testimony of other victims who confirmed her captivity. Victor Kane was convicted on all counts: kidnapping, false imprisonment, operating a criminal enterprise, conspiracy to commit murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His associates received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. The day the verdict was announced, Sarah and David stood on the courthouse steps, facing a wall of cameras and reporters, the questions coming in a relentless barrage. Dr. Chun, how does it feel to finally have justice? Will you return to surgery? Do you blame yourself for the criminals you saved? Sarah raised her hand, silencing the crowd, her voice calm but firm. I don't have all the answers, she said. I'm still processing what happened to me. I'm still healing. But I want to say this. I was taken against my will. I was forced to work under threat of death. And yes, I saved the lives of criminals. But I also saved the lives of human beings. People who were someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The oath I took as a doctor doesn't discriminate. It doesn't ask whether the patient deserves to be saved. It only asks whether I have the skill to save them. And I did. Every single time. Not because Victor Kane forced me, but because that's who I am. The reporters fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. I'm not a hero, Sarah continued. I'm a survivor. And I'm a doctor. Those two things don't contradict each other. They define each other. David took her hand, squeezing it gently, and together they walked away from the courthouse, leaving the questions and the cameras behind. The months that followed were a slow, painful process of rebuilding. Sarah continued therapy, working through the complex PTSD, the nightmares that woke her screaming in the middle of the night, the hypervigilance that made her flinch at sudden movements, the anxiety that flooded her system whenever she entered a confined space. David attended every session with her, learning how to support her recovery, how to recognize the triggers, how to create a safe environment where healing could happen. They moved out of their old house, the memories too painful, the association with Sarah's disappearance too strong. They found a new apartment downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows and natural light, the opposite of the basement cell where Sarah had been held. Metro General welcomed Sarah back, not as a surgeon. She wasn't ready for the operating room, might never be ready, but as a lecturer and researcher. She developed a program focused on medical ethics in extreme situations, drawing on her experiences to teach the next generation of doctors about the moral complexities of their profession. Her first lecture series was titled, The Oath in Darkness, Medical Practice Under Duress. The lecture hall was packed, students and colleagues alike drawn to hear her story, to learn from her experience. David sat in the back row, as he always did, watching his wife transform her trauma into teaching, her pain into purpose. When everything is taken from you, Sarah told the students, her voice carrying across the hall. When you're stripped of your freedom, your dignity, your choices, what remains? For me, it was my oath. The promise I made to preserve life, to do no harm. It was the only thing they couldn't take. The only thing that made me still feel human. She paused, her eyes scanning the young faces before her. You will all face situations in your careers where the right choice isn't clear, where the ethics are murky, where you have to make decisions with incomplete information and impossible constraints. And in those moments, your oath will be your compass. Not because it gives you easy answers, but because it reminds you who you are. The students gave her a standing ovation. 1 year after the trial, on a cold March evening, Sarah and David returned to the Detroit River waterfront. The same place where her car had been found 8 years earlier. The same place where everyone had assumed she had taken her own life. They walked along the path in silence, the city lights reflecting off the dark water, the wind carrying the scent of the coming spring. I used to hate this place, Sarah said finally, her voice soft. Every time I thought about it during my captivity, I felt this rage, that everyone assumed I was dead, that they gave up looking, that they held a funeral for me while I was still alive, still fighting. David said nothing, just listened, his hand in hers. But now, Sarah continued, I think I understand. You couldn't have known. You did everything you could. And maybe having this place be associated with my death all those years made it easier for you to survive. Made it easier to move forward. She turned to face him, her eyes clear, her expression peaceful in a way David hadn't seen in 8 years. "I don't hate this place anymore," she said, "because I'm not dead. I survived. And now, every time I come here, it's not a place of death. It's a place of resurrection." David pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, his face buried in her hair. "I love you," he whispered. "I never stopped. Not for a single day." "I know," Sarah replied. "That's what kept me alive. Knowing you were out there. Knowing you were waiting. Knowing that if I could just hold on long enough, you'd find me." They stood there as the sun set over Detroit, two people who had been torn apart by violence and reunited by hope. Their love tested by 7 years of separation and emerging stronger for it. The next morning, Sarah received a letter. It was from Jake Morrison, the young man whose body had carried her desperate message. He was out of prison, having served his time trying to rebuild his life. The letter was simple, handwritten, the words awkward but sincere. "Dr. Chen, I don't know if you'll remember me. I'm the guy you put your ID in. I know that sounds crazy, but you saved my life twice. Once when you operated on me, and once when you used me to send your message. I'm out now, trying to go straight. I enrolled in community college. I'm studying to be a paramedic. I figure if someone like you can keep saving lives even in hell, maybe I can do something good with the life you saved. Thank you, Jake." Sarah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, the weight of 8 years finally lifting from her shoulders. "What is it?" David asked, concern in his voice. Sarah handed him the letter, unable to speak, the emotion too overwhelming. David read it, and when he looked up, he was smiling. "You didn't just survive," he said. "You changed lives. Even in captivity. Even in darkness. You made a difference." Sarah nodded, her hand instinctively moving to her chest, where her hospital ID badge now hung on a new lanyard, returned to her after the trial. A symbol of who she was, who she had always been, who she would always be. A doctor, a healer, a survivor. "I did my job," she said simply. "That's all. I just did my job." And in that moment, David understood that Sarah had won. Not because she had escaped. Not because her captors had been punished. But because they had tried to break her, tried to corrupt her, tried to turn her skills into instruments of evil. And they had failed. She was still Dr. Sarah Chen. Still a surgeon. Still devoted to her oath. The darkness had not consumed her. It had only made her light shine brighter. 5 years after her rescue, Sarah Chen stood in the surgical observation gallery at Metro General Hospital, watching a young resident perform a complex cardiac procedure. David stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort and support. "She's good," Sarah murmured, watching the resident's hands move with precision through the surgical field. "Steady, confident. She'll be an excellent surgeon." "You taught her well," David replied. Sarah had never returned to the operating room as a surgeon. The trauma of her captivity had made it impossible. But she had found a new calling as a teacher, as a mentor, shaping the next generation of doctors, passing on her skills and her wisdom without ever touching a scalpel. It was enough. More than enough. As they left the hospital that evening, walking hand in hand through the parking structure, the same structure where Sarah had been taken 13 years earlier, David felt her hesitate. "You okay?" he asked, concerned. Sarah looked around the structure, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the shadows deep between the parked cars. She took a slow, deliberate breath. "I'm okay," she said, and this time she meant it. The nightmares were less frequent now. The hypervigilance had faded. The anxiety no longer controlled her life. She had survived. She had healed. She had transformed her trauma into purpose. And she was finally, truly, completely free. They walked to their car together, two people who had been tested by the cruelest circumstances and had emerged stronger, their love deeper, their commitment unshakable. Sarah Chen had spent 7 years in darkness, but she had never let the darkness in. And that made all the difference. Victor Kane is currently serving life in prison without parole at a maximum security facility in Michigan. The network's operations were completely dismantled, leading to 63 arrests and the closure of 4 underground medical facilities across the Midwest. Dr. Sarah Chun continues to teach at Metro General Hospital and has published extensively on medical ethics and trauma recovery. Jake Morrison graduated from community college and now works as a certified paramedic in Detroit. Dr. David and Dr. Sarah Chun celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in 2023. Sarah's hospital ID badge is now displayed in the Metro General Museum of Medical History, alongside her story, a testament to survival, resilience, and the unbreakable power of the Hippocratic Oath.